This is the arcade build guide for Jammix. Everything you see here is what you'll need to build your arcade setup for Jammix. What also is included with Jammix but is not shown here is the I/O shield, as this is for PC builds. So I'll put that off to the side. Before we get started, the first thing is you'll want to have a properly formatted MiSTer SD card. You can use either of the MiSTer installers to build your SD card. I'll leave links to those in the description. I'd probably recommend the Windows one for Jammix just because it formats the card and puts all the files on it. There are two files that do need to be configured, and those configurations are listed in the description of this video. Those files are the u-boot.txt that's found in the Linux directory, and also the MiSTer.ini file. And the changes that you need to make to those are also listed in this in the description of this video. So now that we have our properly formatted SD card, I'm going to go ahead and put it in the DE10 right now, and that's on the bottom side of the DE10. I want to be careful putting it in there because that little connector is kind of fragile. It's also important to point out that the DE10 Nano is not included with with Jammix, and needs to be purchased separately. You also should probably pick up a 128 meg SD RAM for it, also not included. You'll need this to play Neo Geo, many of the arcade cores, so it's just a good thing to have, especially since we're doing an arcade build here. What is included with Jammix is this heatsink. It will keep your DE10 FPGA nice and cool, so we want to have that. Since I've already put in the SD card here on the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and put the DE10 off to the side until we need it. So the first thing we'll want to do when we get started here is start putting in the standoffs where the DE10 will sit. And if you can see on the board, there's this nice outline for where the DE10 sits. We're going to put in this standoff, and this standoff first. And how I like to do that is just turn the board over to the back side, go ahead and drop in a screw, and take one of these standoffs and just kind of put it on there finger tight. I do 3 of the standoffs first, and I'll show you why in a minute. The standoff that's closest to the USB port, I put that one on after I've plugged in the USB port. Just makes it cleaner and easier to get to. And you can see I'm just turning over the board here and putting the screw in each one of these, and then just flipping the board back over and putting the standoff on. I'm also going to go ahead now and plug in the USB cable. Want to make sure that's a nice, good, snug fit. Be careful not to brush any of the components right here when you put that in. And now we can go ahead and put in that last standoff for the DE10. Put that on the bottom side here, and screw in the last standoff. At this point, we can take the included Ethernet cable and put that in there. And right now is a good time to talk about configuring our first 2 jumpers. So I'll show them to you right here. I'll see if you can get a good look at them. These first 2 jumpers right here, these are the sync on green jumper, which for an arcade build we're not going to need. Most arcade monitors aren't really sync on green. So what I like to do is take that jumper off and just put it on one pin off to the side, so it's not jumping anything. It kind of wobbles around. I leave it there so that if we ever want to use that head or that jumper, it's there. And then same with the 5 volt VGA power. I'm sorry, 3 volt. There's a 3 volt and 5 volt VGA power. Again, I just put this pin off to the side, so it's not really jumpering anything. This little jumper allows for your VGA port to output 3.3 volts or 5 volt if you were going to power something from it. So just a nice little feature to have. At this point, we can go ahead and put the DE10 on the standoffs. And what you want to do is you want to make sure you have the Ethernet port facing the ATX port on Jammix. So it would look something like that. And then just again to double check you're orientating your DE10 the right way, you want the barrel jack of the DE10 to be on the back side of the Jammix, the I/O side here. So once you have that lined up, you can go grab your 4 female female to male standoffs and put those in. The DE10 should sit nice and snug with these standoffs in, and even when they're just finger tight. And the DE10 should line up near perfect on these standoff holes. You shouldn't have to force anything or angle anything. Everything should be perfectly straight. So at this point in time, it gets us up to our next configuration. And one of the things that I really like about Jammix is it has two different audio DACs to choose from. You have the standard DAC, which is used on the standard I/O board for MiSTer, and then you have an I2S DAC. I really like the I2S DAC for arcade builds. I've noticed with the I2S DAC that we don't have as much clicking or popping when you change in between cores, and it's almost virtually silent. So just a really good DAC. And how you configure Jammix to use that I2S DAC, the first thing you have to do is come over to your DE10, and you have to flip one of these switches on it. It is going to be the first switch that is closest to the Ethernet port. So here's this Ethernet port on the DE10. You do not want to use the Ethernet port on the Jammix. You want the one on the DE10, the one that is closest to it. So it's the one that has the three little buttons right there next to it. We want to turn that one on, and then we want to make sure the rest of them are off. On is the direction towards the FPGA, and I'll try to see if I can get you a good view of it. So you can see how this one switch right here is the one that is on, and the other three are off. See if I can't show you. So that tells the DE10 to output for IS2 audio. The next thing we want to do is you have two jumpers here that are next to the USB Ethernet stack. So these two jumpers right here, there's a label that's res and there's a label that's I2S. And I'll see if I can show it to you. You can barely see it there, but you want to brush my screws off there. You want to orientate everything so that the headers are towards the I2S side, and you kind of see that there. Here's res, and here's the I2S. So once those are set up, you're good to go. The last set of jumpers that you'll need to configure are: do you want to output in stereo or mono? And since my arcade machine is mono, I have configured the jumpers towards the mono side. So basically these are left side, right side, left side, right side. That's why they're in pairs. But I'm going to go ahead and orientate my jumpers towards mono since I have a mono arcade machine. At this point we can go ahead and plug in those USB cables here, and you just want to plug that in, make sure it has a nice good snug fit. How I like to do the Ethernet cable is I like to fold it in half and get kind of like a loop. So fold it in half, get a loop, and then carefully feed it underneath the DE10. And it should just go straight back. And go ahead and plug that in, make sure you have a nice good click. And you can kind of see it there. So at this point your DE10 is almost set up. We're going to go ahead and start putting in some of the different ribbon cables. The first ribbon cable you can put in is this little one right here. It's going to go to the DE10, and we want to make sure that it sits nice and flush. One of the things, before I get started with that, I like to just kind of fold them into kind of like an L shape. You want to make sure that the cable has just a nice good fit, and doing that kind of helps. This particular cable is not a keyed cable, so it doesn't matter how you put it in. And then you're going to go ahead and put it on the DE10 right here. And make sure it's a nice good snug fit. I'm going to go ahead at this time and put on the fan board. The fan board has these little pins on both sides of it. You need to make sure that those match up nice and neat on the pin headers for the DE10. And you're going to orientate the fan so that the barrel jack faces the I/O portion of the Jammix. So it should go on here like this, and I'm just going to make sure that I line up the pins really good and just push it on. I'm going to do a quick visual inspection to make sure all of these pins are lined up, and you can see like right here my pins are definitely lined up with the pin header. Same on the other side. It's a little bit difficult to see when you have the RAM in there, but they're lined up nice and good. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and put on the next largest ribbon cable. So this is the medium size ribbon cable. This one is keyed, and you can kind of see there's the key slot right here. Let me see if I can you see that key slot right there? And so I want to make sure that my ribbon cable has the key orientated for that slot. And I know it's dark, it's hard to see, but I'll go ahead and put in the keyed connector right there, and then put it onto Jammix. Again, you should just get a nice good firm press. It should slide right in. You want to visually inspect it, make sure you haven't missed any of the pins. Looks good. Now I'm going to go ahead and move out to the largest cable. If you remember at the beginning of the video, we put in our micro SD card right here. You want to make sure that that's in before you get this cable on, and that your micro SD card has been pre-formatted to MiSTer. So I'm going to go ahead and I think I'm going to start on the Jammix side here, and I'm going to just go ahead and carefully place that in, and it should slide right in and give it a nice firm press. I want to make sure that I did not miss any of the pins, so I'm going to look it over really good. And then again, I'm going to go ahead and plug it into the DE10 right here. And same thing, give it a nice good firm press. Make sure I haven't missed any pins. And give it a good visual inspection. And it looks good. At this point, I'm going to take 4 of our screws and screw in the fan board. That last ribbon cable. If you're having a hard time like me putting in this last screw, you can take off that ribbon cable. I'm going to go ahead and take off that ribbon cable off the top there. It'll make it easier to get to this screw. Go ahead and put that ribbon cable back on, make sure you didn't miss anything. And at this point, the Jammix is just about built out with the exception of our arcade feet. We, at this point, are going to go ahead and configure the Jammix for the different types of arcade harnesses. And if you go ahead and look at the instruction manual, that's the operator's guide, there's a link in the description to it at the bottom of this description of this video. You'll see there's a section for dips. And this is in here to help people remember what you need to do to what dips do what. But the dips are important for depending on what type of arcade machine you have and what type of harness you have in your arcade machine. So while we're talking about arcade connections, right now is a good time to assume that everybody's going to power their arcade machine using the JAMA Edge. It is possible to power it using the ATX power, or you can even use the barrel jack on the fan board itself. For Jammix, I would not recommend using the power on the DE10. If you don't use the power on the fan board, it's not going to have some of the functions for soft power on. But that's not that big of a deal because we're not using those in an arcade machine. The other thing to note is while you can power Jammix from the power supply that comes with the DE10, it's not recommended. You should definitely get a stronger, better power supply, something that's at least 4 amps, if not more. That will help make sure that Jammix is getting a good power supply. So again, we're going to assume for the arcade build, we're going to use the JAMA edge, and we're going to be powering from right here. Another thing to point out is, I believe it's pins E and 27. Those are ground wires on most JAMA and CHAMA edges. We want to make sure that those are not connected to your power switch ground. They want to be the type of switch that or ground that you use for like your micro controller buttons. So just another good thing to point out. More details on that are in the operator's guide, and again, that's attached in the description of this video if you have questions about it. So going forward, assuming we're using this JAMA edge to power everything, let's talk about the dip switches. So dip switch number 7 is an important one regarding power. We want it on for most arcade builds, and the reason that we want dip switch number 7 on is that it allows Jammix to start on power. If we were doing a PC build, we would want that dip switch off, and that would allow us to use the power button on the PC to turn on Jammix. So like I said, most arcade machines we want to have power on onto the board as soon as we turn on the arcade machine, whether you plug it in or have a power switch for your arcade machine. So again, dip switch number 7 on. So at this point now it depends on how your arcade machine is set up. So I think maybe we'll start first with JAMA and CPS2. So if you have the traditional JAMA harness, that's buttons 1 through 3, and then you'll have buttons 4, 5, and 6 for each player on the kick harness here. And you'll need a Capcom CPS2 kick harness if you use this method. And in order to get that to work right, this is the dip switch settings for it. So it's 1, 2, and 7. And again, you can see that in the operator's guide. And you'll see a small dip diagram like this. Again, it says for always leave on for 1 and 2, and 7 for forces power on. And if you use that type of a setup, then you'll definitely get CPS2 with players 1 and 2, buttons 1 through 6, start and coin. So let's talk about users that use a CHARMA harness. If you're unfamiliar with the CHARMA harness, that's the Chinese, I believe it's Chinese Arcade Manufacturer, Amusement Manufacturers Association, which is what JAMA is, the Japanese one. But CHAMA allows, a CHAMA harness is a full harness. Everything is wired on it and connected up. And it allows you to get buttons 1 through 6 all on the JAMA edge with coin and start for players 1 and 2. So let's roll over to CHARMA at this point. Again, that's players 1 and 2, buttons 1 through 6, and start all on the JAMA edge. And for that, we'll just want to make sure we have dip switches 1, 2, 3, and 7. So again, you can always look at that dip guide that's in the operator's guide, and there's links to that in the description. And then finally, let's talk about the last way to configure Jammix, and that is 4-player mode. And that will allow players 1 and 2 to have buttons 1 through 6, and players 3 and 4 to have buttons. I see that the text is wrong here. Let me go ahead and fix that really quick. That's buttons 1 through 3. I'm sorry, buttons 1 through 4. And we'll have buttons 1 through 4 there on players 3 and 4. So in order to have 4-player mode, you must have both a CHAMA harness and a CPS2 kick harness. And for that CPS2 kick harness, you need a full kick harness, not the kind that's only 6 buttons, but the one that has all the cables populated for it. And in order to make that work, we need to have dip switch settings 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7 on. And so again, that's 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7 on for 4-player mode with a full CPS2 kick harness and a full CHAMA harness. So at this point, depending on which type of harness you have for your arcade machine. I think most people are probably, and I'm going to set it here, and this is how it comes from the factory, come with a JAMA harness with CPS2 kick. So again, I'm just going to set it back to that original state, which is what Jammix comes for, which is dips 1, 2, and 7. And that's how my arcade machine's set up. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and put on the arcade feet. I really like using the optional arcade feet. In my arcade machine, I have a place to mount boards, and the arcade feet make it easy to do that. You kind of really want to use the arcade feet because there are a bunch of connections back here, and you don't want, you know, that sitting on anything. So like the arcade feet kind of lift it up. All of those solder joints for all of the connectors are on the back side there. So you might have noticed that on this particular corner that the hole for the arcade feet is not in the far corner here, and the reason for that is this standoff. Just having a hole too close to it would make this brittle. Also, this is the hole that we also use for the ITX connection, or for the ITX motherboard. It's how the orientations for the standard for ITX are set up. And again, not a big deal. We still put our arcade feet on there. I kind of put those on finger tight, and I'll go back with a screwdriver and tighten them up. Also, while I have the board flipped over here, I might go ahead and tighten up the standoffs from the bottom with that screwdriver. And I'll go ahead and tighten them up right here. It's usually just like a quarter turn. If you put them in finger tight, they're really pretty good. And same with on the bottom of the board here where those standoffs are. Just give it that last quarter turn, get it nice and tight. Alright. And that is a fully configured and set up Jammix for arcade machines. Again, the operator's guide is at the bottom of, a link to it is at the bottom of the description of this video, and happy arcading.